The morning mist clung to the mountains surrounding Falcon Ridge Naval Air Station like a shroud, obscuring the peaks that had watched over countless pilots as they pushed the boundaries of human flight. Commander Sarah Phoenix Chen stood at the edge of the flight deck, her dress whites pristine despite the humid Pacific Northwest air. Today marked the 5th anniversary of Operation Nightfall, the mission that had changed everything about modern aerial warfare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The ceremony was meant to honor the fallen, but Sarah knew it was really about something else entirely. It was about the mission that everyone said couldn't be done, the flight that had broken every rule in the tactical manual, and the pilot who had proven that sometimes the impossible was just another word for untested. Admiral Rebecca Torres stepped to the podium, her silver hair catching the filtered sunlight that managed to penetrate the coastal fog. Behind her, the flags of every squadron that had participated in Operation Nightfall hung motionless in the still air. The gathering included nearly 200 personnel, from seasoned veterans to fresh-faced ensigns who had only heard whispers of what really happened that night 5 years ago. Torres cleared her throat, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the authority of 3 decades in naval aviation. 5 years ago, our nation faced a crisis that threatened to destabilize the entire Pacific region. A rogue military faction had seized control of the Crimson Islands, establishing a fortress that intelligence deemed impregnable. Their surface-to-air missile systems created a defensive umbrella that no conventional aircraft could penetrate. Sarah listened to the familiar words, but her mind drifted to the conversation that had changed her life. She could still see Captain Marcus Webb's face as he delivered the news that would define her career. The mission planners had spent weeks developing strategies, running simulations, consulting with the finest tactical minds in the military. Every scenario ended the same way: total mission failure with catastrophic losses. The Crimson Islands fortress wasn't just heavily defended, it was a technological marvel of modern warfare. Layer upon layer of radar systems, electronic jamming equipment, and guided missile batteries created an environment where even stealth aircraft couldn't operate safely. The enemy had learned from every conflict of the past 50 years, building a defensive network that seemed to anticipate every possible approach vector. Sarah remembered the briefing room where the mission parameters had been laid out like a death sentence. The target was a command bunker buried deep within the mountain core of the largest island. Intelligence indicated that the rogue faction's leadership was planning a series of coordinated strikes against civilian targets across the region. The window for action was closing rapidly, measured in hours rather than days. Every senior pilot in the squadron had studied the tactical situation. The consensus was unanimous. The mission was suicide. The approach routes were too well defended, the target too deeply buried, the margin for error too small. Even if an aircraft somehow managed to penetrate the defensive perimeter, the likelihood of successful target engagement and extraction was virtually zero. But Sarah had seen something the others missed. While her colleagues focused on the obvious approach vectors, she had spent hours analyzing the meteorological data, studying the unique geographical features of the islands, and examining the enemy's defensive patterns for weaknesses that weren't immediately apparent. The answer, when it finally came to her, was so unconventional that it bordered on madness. Admiral Torres continued her address, but Sarah's attention remained fixed on that pivotal moment 5 years ago when Captain Webb had asked for volunteers. The silence in the briefing room had been deafening. These were pilots who had flown combat missions over hostile territory, who had faced enemy fire, and emerged victorious. But this mission was different. This was beyond the realm of calculated risk, and into the territory of near-certain death. Sarah had raised her hand. The reaction had been immediate and predictable. Murmurs of disbelief, exchanged glances that questioned her judgment, and barely concealed expressions of pity for what they assumed was a career-ending decision. She was one of the newest pilots in the squadron, with the least combat experience and the most to prove. In their eyes, she was volunteering for suicide out of misplaced ambition or naive heroism. Captain Webb had studied her for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Lieutenant Chen, this isn't a training exercise. The survival probability for this mission is estimated at less than 15%. Sarah had met his gaze without flinching. Sir, I believe I've identified an approach vector that the mission planners haven't considered. The survival probability might be higher than estimated if we're willing to attempt something completely unconventional. The skepticism in the room had been palpable. Here was a junior pilot claiming to have found a solution that had eluded the most experienced tactical minds in the Navy. The presumption was staggering, the confidence seemingly misplaced. But Webb had been willing to listen, perhaps recognizing something in Sarah's demeanor that spoke to genuine insight rather than reckless bravado. What followed was the most intense planning session of Sarah's career. She had outlined her theory about using the island's unique thermal dynamics to mask an aircraft's heat signature during specific atmospheric conditions. The approach would require flying at altitudes and speeds that pushed both pilot and machine to their absolute limits, threading a needle of opportunity that existed for less than 20 minutes during the pre-dawn hours. The plan was audacious to the point of impossibility. It required precision flying that left no room for error, perfect timing that depended on variables beyond human control, and a level of aircraft performance that exceeded documented specifications. Most importantly, it required a pilot willing to attempt maneuvers that had never been tested in combat conditions. The debate that followed had been fierce. Senior officers argued that the mission was already dangerous enough without adding experimental tactics to the equation. The conventional wisdom favored a more traditional approach, even if the odds were poor. At least with established tactics, they could predict the likely failure modes and plan accordingly. But conventional wisdom had already declared the mission impossible. Sarah's plan offered something that no amount of traditional thinking could provide, a genuine chance of success. It was a slim chance, built on theoretical calculations and untested assumptions, but it was more hope than any other strategy had offered. Admiral Torres's voice brought Sarah back to the present as the ceremony continued with its formal recognition of courage and sacrifice. But Sarah knew that the real story of Operation Nightfall wasn't being told here. The official reports had been sanitized, the classified details buried beneath layers of security protocols that would protect the truth for decades to come. The real story began 3 days before the mission, when Sarah had been called to Captain Webb's office for what she assumed would be a final briefing. Instead, she found herself facing a review board that seemed determined to remove her from the operation entirely. The concerns they raised were not about her flying ability or her tactical understanding, but about something far more fundamental. Commander Patricia Hayes, the squadron's executive officer, had been the most vocal critic. Lieutenant Chen, your service record is exemplary, but you lack the combat experience necessary for a mission of this magnitude. We're not questioning your abilities as a pilot, but this operation requires seasoned judgment that only comes from extensive exposure to hostile environments. The underlying message was clear, though never explicitly stated. Sarah was being judged not just on her qualifications, but on perceptions about her capability to handle the psychological pressure of combat. The military had made significant progress in integrating women into combat roles, but institutional biases remained embedded in the evaluation process. Sarah had expected this challenge and had prepared accordingly. Ma'am, with respect, combat experience is valuable, but it's not the only factor that determines mission success. This particular operation requires skills that transcend traditional combat flying. The approach vector I've proposed demands precision navigation, environmental awareness, and aircraft control techniques that are more relevant to my background than conventional combat experience. The review had continued for over an hour, with board members probing every aspect of her preparation and reasoning. They questioned her understanding of the enemy defensive systems, her contingency planning for equipment failures, and her psychological readiness for the isolation and pressure of a solo mission deep in hostile territory. Each question had been answered with the thoroughness and confidence that Sarah had cultivated through months of intensive preparation. She had studied every aspect of the mission until she could recite tactical details in her sleep. More importantly, she had developed an understanding of the operational environment that went beyond memorized facts to encompass the intuitive grasp that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. The final question had come from Captain Webb himself. Lieutenant, if you're wrong about this approach vector, if your calculations are off by even a small margin, you won't just fail the mission, you'll die. The rescue probability for this operation is essentially zero. Are you prepared to accept that level of personal risk for what might be a theoretical advantage? Sarah's response had been immediate and unwavering. Sir, if I'm wrong, the mission fails regardless of who flies it. But if I'm right, we have a chance to succeed where conventional tactics would certainly fail. The risk to me personally is irrelevant compared to the potential consequences of inaction. That response had apparently satisfied the review board, because 3 hours later Sarah found herself in the final mission briefing with full authorization to proceed. But she could see in the faces of her colleagues that their doubts remained. They were willing to let her attempt the impossible, but they clearly expected to be attending her memorial service within a week. The night before the mission, Sarah had walked the flight deck alone, running through the complex sequence of maneuvers that would either make her career or end her life. The FA-18F Super Hornet that would carry her into battle was a magnificent machine, but even its advanced systems would be pushed beyond normal operational parameters during the mission. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, the lead maintenance supervisor, had joined her during this final inspection. Santos was a 20-year veteran who had prepped aircraft for some of the Navy's most challenging missions, and her opinion carried weight throughout the squadron. "Lieutenant, I've checked every system twice. This bird is as ready as I can make her, but you know as well as I do that machines have limits." Sarah had nodded, running her hand along the aircraft's wing. "Maria, what's your honest assessment? Can she handle what I'm asking of her?" Santos had been quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "The aircraft specs say no. The performance envelope doesn't include the kind of sustained high-stress operations you're planning, but I've seen machines exceed their specifications when the pilot knows how to work with them instead of against them. You've got that touch, Lieutenant. If anyone can coax extra performance out of this bird, it's you." That conversation had provided the final boost of confidence Sarah needed. The technical aspects of the mission were solid, the tactical planning was thorough, and the aircraft was prepared to its maximum capability. The only remaining variable was her own performance under pressure, and that was something no amount of preparation could guarantee. The morning of the mission had arrived with the kind of perfect weather conditions that Sarah's plan required. The atmospheric pressure was optimal, the wind patterns aligned with her calculations, and the thermal dynamics around the Crimson Islands created exactly the masking effect she needed. It was as if the universe had conspired to provide the narrow window of opportunity that her unconventional approach demanded. Captain Webb had conducted the final briefing with the kind of professional detachment that masked deeper concerns. "Lieutenant Chen, you have authorization to proceed with your planned approach vector. All supporting elements are in position, though given the nature of your route, communication will be intermittent at best. You'll be operating independently for the majority of the mission. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The weight of that independence had settled on Sarah's shoulders like a physical burden. In most military operations, pilots could rely on extensive support networks, air traffic control, electronic warfare coordination, search and rescue assets, and communication with command authorities. But her mission would take her through environments where none of that support could reach. She would be alone in the most dangerous airspace on Earth, flying an aircraft at the edge of its performance envelope, attempting maneuvers that existed only in theoretical calculations. If something went wrong, if her assumptions proved incorrect, if the enemy defenses adapted faster than anticipated, there would be no backup plan and no rescue mission. The walk to her aircraft had felt like a march to execution. Other pilots watched from the deck, their expressions mixing admiration for her courage with pity for what they assumed was her doom. The maintenance crew had completed their final checks with unusual solemnity, each person understanding that they might be the last to see Lieutenant Chen alive. But as Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began the pre-flight procedures, something remarkable happened. The doubt and fear that had accumulated over weeks of preparation simply evaporated. In their place came a sense of clarity and purpose that transformed anxiety into focused determination. This was what she had trained for, what she had been born to do. The engine startup was routine, but Sarah could feel the power of the twin turbofans as they spooled up to operational parameters. Every system check confirmed that Chief Santos and her team had prepared the aircraft to perfection. The FA-18F was ready to attempt the impossible, and so was its pilot. Tower clearance came through her headset with the kind of crisp professionalism that masked the historic significance of the moment. "Phoenix 1, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed, Lieutenant." Sarah taxied to the catapult with steady hands, her mind already shifting into the focused state that would sustain her through the next several hours. The catapult launch was violent and exhilarating, accelerating the fully loaded aircraft from 0 to over 150 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. But Sarah barely noticed the familiar sensation. Her attention was already focused on the complex navigation requirements that would guide her through the first phase of her unconventional approach. As Falcon Ridge disappeared behind her, Sarah began the transformation from skeptical experiment to legendary mission. The next few hours would determine whether her theories about thermal masking and unconventional approach vectors were breakthrough innovations or fatal miscalculations. But for the first time since volunteering for this assignment, Sarah felt no doubt about the outcome. She was going to prove that the impossible was just another word for untested. And in doing so, she would change forever how the military thought about combat aviation and the pilots who pushed its boundaries. The initial flight path took Sarah northwest over the Pacific, following what appeared to be a routine training route that would attract no special attention from enemy surveillance systems. But 30 minutes after takeoff, she began the first of several radical course changes that would take her far from any established flight corridor. The Crimson Islands lay nearly 400 miles from Falcon Ridge, surrounded by international waters that had become a no-man's land since the rogue faction's takeover. Conventional wisdom suggested approaching the target from the south, where the terrain offered some natural concealment and the defensive coverage was theoretically lighter. Sarah's plan called for exactly the opposite approach. She would circle wide to the north, using the island chain's own geography against its defenders. The northern approach was considered impossible because it required flying through the densest concentration of surface-to-air missile sites. But Sarah had identified a critical flaw in the defensive network's design. The missile systems were positioned to engage threats coming from expected directions at expected altitudes. They were optimized for intercepting conventional aircraft following predictable attack profiles. But they had never been tested against an aircraft willing to exploit the unique atmospheric conditions that existed around the islands during specific weather patterns. The science behind Sarah's approach was complex but elegant. The Crimson Islands sat atop an underwater mountain range that created distinctive thermal currents in the surrounding atmosphere. During certain conditions, these currents formed layers of varying temperature and density that could mask an aircraft's heat signature from infrared detection systems. But exploiting this natural phenomenon required flying at altitudes and speeds that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their absolute limits. Sarah would need to maintain precise positioning within thermal layers that were sometimes only 50 feet thick, while navigating through airspace defended by some of the most sophisticated weapons systems ever deployed. The first test of her theory came as she approached the outer perimeter of the defensive network. Sarah dropped her aircraft to an altitude that would have been considered recklessly low under normal circumstances, skimming just above the wave tops as she searched for the thermal signatures her calculations predicted. The ocean surface below was a patchwork of different temperatures, visible through her aircraft's advanced sensors as distinct bands of color. Sarah needed to find the specific thermal boundary that would provide maximum masking effect, while still allowing her to maintain the speed and maneuverability necessary for the approach. When she found it, the sensation was unlike anything she had experienced in her flying career. The aircraft seemed to slip between layers of air with different physical properties, creating a cushioning effect that actually reduced the normal turbulence of low-altitude flight. It was as if the atmosphere itself was conspiring to hide her from the enemy's detection systems. Sarah's radio crackled with a final transmission from Falcon Ridge. Phoenix 1, you are now entering the communication blackout zone. From this point forward, you're on your own. Good luck? The words carried a finality that emphasized just how alone she would be for the next phase of the mission. Radio silence was both a blessing and a curse. It eliminated the possibility of enemy forces intercepting her communications, but it also meant that no one could provide warnings about changing tactical situations or offer assistance if something went wrong. Sarah was now operating in a bubble of isolation that would persist until she either completed the mission or failed in the attempt. The approach to the main island cluster required threading a needle between two of the most heavily defended positions in the entire defensive network. Sarah's route would take her within a mile of missile batteries that could destroy her aircraft in seconds if they acquired a targeting lock. But her thermal masking should render her invisible to their guidance systems, as long as she maintained precise positioning within the atmospheric layers. The tension of flying through the outer defensive perimeter was almost unbearable. Sarah could see the enemy installations through her targeting systems, close enough to count individual buildings and vehicles. She was flying through the heart of hostile territory, completely dependent on theoretical calculations about atmospheric physics to keep her alive. But the theory held. Sarah's aircraft remained undetected as she penetrated deeper into the defensive network, following a route that would have been impossible for any conventional attack. The thermal masking was working exactly as her calculations had predicted, creating an envelope of invisibility that allowed her to operate in plain sight of the enemy's most sophisticated sensors. The final approach to the target required the most dangerous maneuver of the entire mission. Sarah would need to climb rapidly from her low-altitude hiding place to an attack altitude that would allow effective weapons delivery against the hardened bunker target. This climb would take her out of the thermal masking layers and expose her to the full capability of the defensive systems. But Sarah had timed this exposure for the precise moment when her unconventional approach would create maximum confusion among the enemy defenders. They had designed their systems to engage threats following predictable attack profiles, not aircraft that appeared suddenly from impossible directions at impossible speeds. The climb was violent and sustained, pushing the FA-18F's engines to maximum power as Sarah clawed for altitude while maintaining the precise heading that would align her with the target. G-forces pressed her deep into her seat as the aircraft accelerated through its attack profile, every system strained to its operational limit. At the moment of weapons release, Sarah felt a sense of completion that transcended the tactical objectives of the mission. She had proven that unconventional thinking could overcome seemingly impossible odds, that careful analysis and precise execution could achieve what brute force could not. The weapons found their target with devastating accuracy, penetrating deep into the mountain bunker and neutralizing the command structure that had threatened regional stability. But Sarah's celebration was brief. Now came the most dangerous part of the entire mission: the escape. Enemy forces were no longer confused about her presence or location. Every defensive system in the network was now focused on preventing her escape, creating a gauntlet of guided missiles and electronic jamming that would test every skill she had developed during her flying career. The egress route that Sarah had planned was as unconventional as her approach, but now she was flying a damaged aircraft through airspace that was fully alert to her presence. The margin for error had disappeared entirely, replaced by a desperate race against enemy weapon systems that were adapting to her tactics in real time. What happened during the next 20 minutes would become the stuff of legend, a display of flying skill and tactical innovation that would be studied by military aviators for generations to come. But in the moment, Sarah was simply focused on survival, using every technique she had learned to stay ahead of the enemy's attempts to destroy her. The flight home to Falcon Ridge would test her endurance and skill in ways that no training scenario could have prepared her for. But Sarah had already proven the most important point. The mission that everyone said was impossible had been accomplished by a pilot who refused to accept conventional limitations. As she cleared the outer edge of the defensive network and began the long flight back to base, Sarah allowed herself to consider the magnitude of what she had achieved. She had not only completed an impossible mission, but had done so using tactics that would revolutionize modern combat aviation. The radio silence that had isolated her during the mission phase was about to end, and with it would come recognition that would transform her from an unproven junior pilot to a legend of naval aviation. But more importantly, she had proven to herself and to everyone who had doubted her that determination and innovation could overcome any obstacle. The impossible had become merely difficult, and difficult had become routine. Sarah Phoenix Chen was bringing home more than just mission success. She was bringing home a new understanding of what was possible when courage met preparation and conventional wisdom yielded to creative thinking. The return flight to Falcon Ridge should have been routine, but Sarah quickly discovered that completing the impossible mission was only the beginning of her challenges. As she cleared the defensive perimeter around the Crimson Islands, her aircraft systems began registering damage that she hadn't noticed during the adrenaline-fueled combat phase. Warning lights illuminated across her instrument panel like a constellation of problems. The FA-18F had taken more punishment than initially apparent, with hydraulic pressure dropping steadily and engine temperature readings climbing toward dangerous levels. The aircraft that had performed flawlessly during the most demanding portions of the mission was now struggling to maintain basic flight operations. Sarah ran through her emergency procedures with practiced efficiency, but the combination of problems created a scenario that wasn't covered in any training manual. She had multiple systems failing simultaneously while operating hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly airfield, with fuel reserves that were already marginal due to the extended combat maneuvering. The first indication that her problems extended beyond mechanical failures came through her radio as she attempted to re-establish communication with Falcon Ridge. Instead of the expected response from air traffic control, Sarah heard voices that shouldn't have been on the frequency-encrypted transmissions, using call signs that didn't match any unit she recognized. Lieutenant Commander David Park, the communications officer aboard the USS Intrepid, was monitoring the secure channels when he detected the unauthorized traffic. His experience with electronic intelligence gathering immediately identified the signatures as hostile forces, but their presence on classified frequencies suggested something far more troubling than routine enemy surveillance. Park's analysis revealed that the unauthorized communications were coordinating a search and rescue operation, but not one designed to help Sarah return safely to base. Enemy forces had launched multiple aircraft with the specific mission of intercepting her before she could deliver intelligence about their defensive capabilities and tactical weaknesses. The rogue faction controlling the Crimson Islands had recognized that Sarah's successful penetration of their defensive network represented an existential threat to their operations. If she returned with detailed information about their capabilities and vulnerabilities, it would enable follow-up operations that could destroy their carefully constructed fortress. More disturbing was the sophistication of their response. The enemy aircraft weren't flying random search patterns hoping to stumble across Sarah's damaged fighter. They were using predictive algorithms based on her known fuel consumption, aircraft performance limitations, and probable return routes to establish intercept positions with mathematical precision. Sarah became aware of the pursuit when her aircraft's radar warning receiver began detecting search patterns that were far too organized to be coincidental. Multiple contacts were moving in coordinated sweeps, each aircraft covering a specific sector in a grid pattern that would inevitably locate her if she continued on her current heading. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Sarah's damaged aircraft couldn't sustain the high-speed maneuvering that would be necessary to evade multiple pursuers, and her weapons were already expended from the bunker attack. She was essentially defenseless against enemy fighters that were specifically hunting for her. Captain Elena Rodriguez, the intelligence officer who had helped plan Operation Nightfall, was monitoring the situation from the Tactical Operations Center at Falcon Ridge. Her secure communications with other intelligence assets painted a picture that was even more alarming than the immediate threat to Sarah's aircraft. The enemy response suggested capabilities that went far beyond what intelligence assessments had predicted. The rogue faction wasn't just operating captured military equipment. They had access to sophisticated command and control systems that enabled real-time coordination of complex operations. This level of capability implied support from sources that had never been identified. Rodriguez's analysis indicated that the enemy forces had been tracking Sarah's mission from the beginning, possibly through compromised communication channels, or by exploiting weaknesses in operational security that hadn't been anticipated. The implications were staggering. If enemy forces could monitor classified military operations, then no mission could be considered secure. The revelation that hostile forces possessed this level of intelligence capability transformed Sarah's personal survival crisis into a matter of national security. The information she carried about enemy defensive systems was valuable, but the knowledge that those same enemies could potentially monitor and counter future operations was catastrophic. Admiral Torres received Rodriguez's intelligence briefing while Sarah was still fighting to stay ahead of her pursuers. The implications forced a complete re-evaluation of the strategic situation and the measures that would be necessary to protect both Sarah and the intelligence she had gathered. Torres faced a decision that would define her career and potentially influence the outcome of the entire conflict. She could authorize a large-scale rescue operation that would guarantee Sarah's survival but might compromise other classified operations. Alternatively, she could maintain operational security and accept the possibility that Sarah and her intelligence would be lost. The debate in the Tactical Operations Center was intense but brief. Officers argued for different approaches based on their assessment of relative risks and benefits. Some advocated for immediate military intervention regardless of the consequences, while others insisted that protecting operational security took precedence over any individual pilot's survival. Torres's decision reflected both her strategic judgment and her personal values. "We're launching a full rescue operation." Lieutenant Chen risked everything to complete an impossible mission. "We're not going to abandon her now because the extraction is complicated." The order went out immediately, but Torres knew that the rescue force would face the same advanced defensive capabilities that Sarah had penetrated through exceptional skill and favorable circumstances. Commander Jackson Hayes received the rescue mission assignment with mixed emotions. His squadron of F/A-18E Super Hornets was perfectly capable of engaging enemy fighters, but they would be operating in airspace where the enemy held every tactical advantage. The defensive systems that Sarah had avoided through stealth and timing would be fully alert and focused on preventing any rescue attempt. Hayes understood that the rescue mission was as much about strategic messaging as pilot recovery. If the Navy abandoned one of its own after a successful mission, it would send a signal of weakness that could influence future conflicts. But if they demonstrated willingness to risk multiple aircraft and personnel for pilot recovery, it would establish precedents that could complicate future decision-making. The rescue force launched from Falcon Ridge 30 minutes after Torres's authorization, consisting of 8 F/A-18E fighters, configured for air-to-air combat and electronic warfare. Their mission was to establish air superiority in the area where Sarah was being pursued, creating a corridor that would allow her damaged aircraft to reach friendly territory. The tactical challenge was immense. The rescue force would be outnumbered by enemy fighters operating with the support of ground-based defensive systems. Success would depend on superior pilot training and aircraft capabilities, but those advantages would be offset by the enemy's intimate knowledge of the operating environment. Sarah was unaware of the rescue operation being launched on her behalf, focused entirely on staying ahead of the pursuing aircraft while nursing her damaged fighter toward friendly airspace. Her fuel situation was becoming critical, with consumption rates elevated due to the engine problems and the maneuvering required to avoid detection. The cat-and-mouse game between Sarah and her pursuers had evolved into a test of endurance and tactical creativity. Enemy pilots were methodically eliminating her possible escape routes, forcing her to make increasingly desperate choices about heading and altitude. Each course change brought her closer to fuel exhaustion, while the pursuit coordination continued to tighten the net around her. Dr. Amanda Foster, the flight surgeon who had cleared Sarah for the original mission, was monitoring her physiological data through the aircraft's biomedical sensors. The readings indicated stress levels that were approaching dangerous territory, with heart rate and blood pressure sustained at levels that couldn't be maintained indefinitely. Foster's concern wasn't just about Sarah's immediate physical condition, but about the decision-making capacity that would be necessary for survival. Prolonged exposure to extreme stress could impair judgment and reaction time, creating vulnerabilities that enemy pilots would be trained to exploit. The biomedical data also revealed something remarkable about Sarah's psychological response to the crisis. Despite the physical indicators of extreme stress, her actions remained precisely controlled and tactically sound. She was maintaining discipline and strategic thinking under conditions that would have overwhelmed many experienced pilots. This psychological resilience had been one of the factors that had convinced Captain Webb to approve Sarah's participation in Operation Nightfall. But seeing it demonstrated under actual combat conditions validated assessments that had been based primarily on training scenarios and psychological evaluations. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, who had prepared Sarah's aircraft for the original mission, was leading the technical analysis of the damage reports being transmitted from the F/A-18F. Her assessment was sobering. The aircraft was operating well beyond normal safety parameters, with multiple systems degraded to the point where catastrophic failure was becoming increasingly probable. Santos's experience with aircraft maintenance under combat conditions gave her unique insight into the relationship between mechanical reliability and pilot survival. She understood that Sarah's skill as a pilot could compensate for many equipment failures, but there were limits to what human capability could overcome. The combination of engine problems, hydraulic leaks, and electrical system irregularities created a maintenance nightmare that would normally ground an aircraft immediately. But Sarah was keeping the F/A-18F operational through a combination of technical knowledge and intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior under stress. Santos found herself developing a professional admiration for Sarah's ability to adapt to rapidly changing mechanical conditions. Most pilots were trained to follow emergency procedures precisely, but Sarah was improvising solutions to problems that weren't covered in any manual. The rescue force was approaching the operational area when Commander Hayes received updated intelligence about enemy dispositions. The threat assessment had changed significantly, with additional aircraft joining the pursuit and ground-based systems repositioning to support the intercept operation. Hayes realized that the enemy response represented a level of tactical sophistication that suggested professional military training and equipment. These weren't irregulars flying captured aircraft. They were organized forces with access to advanced command and control capabilities. The implications transformed the rescue mission from a straightforward pilot recovery operation into a complex military engagement with strategic consequences. Success or failure would influence how future conflicts were conducted and how both sides assessed their relative capabilities. Hayes made the decision to engage enemy forces before they could locate Sarah, using the element of surprise to establish temporary air superiority. The approach was risky because it would reveal the rescue force's presence, but it offered the best chance of creating the conditions necessary for Sarah's extraction. Sarah's first indication that help was coming arrived through her radio as Commander Hayes' voice cut through the static of enemy jamming. "Phoenix 1, this is Rescue Lead. We have 8 birds inbound to your position. Maintain current heading and prepare for escort to friendly airspace." The psychological impact of that transmission was profound. Sarah had been operating under the assumption that she was completely alone, dependent entirely on her own resources for survival. Learning that a rescue force was risking their lives to extract her created both relief and a sense of responsibility that was almost overwhelming. But Sarah's relief was tempered by tactical realism. She understood that the rescue operation would be extremely dangerous for all involved, and that her actions during the next crucial minutes could determine whether the mission succeeded or resulted in additional casualties. The engagement between the rescue force and enemy fighters began with a series of long-range missile exchanges that lit up the sky with contrails and electronic countermeasures. Hayes had positioned his aircraft to maximize their technological advantages while minimizing exposure to ground-based defensive systems. The enemy response was immediate and coordinated, with multiple aircraft converging on the rescue force from different directions. But the Navy pilots had trained extensively for exactly this type of engagement, and their superior aircraft and weapon systems began to establish tactical dominance. Sarah watched the air battle developing around her position with a mixture of awe and guilt. 8 of the Navy's finest pilots were risking their lives to extract her from a situation that her own actions had created. The weight of that responsibility was almost as challenging as the original mission had been. Commander Hayes' tactical coordination was masterful, using electronic warfare systems to disrupt enemy communications while directing his pilots through a series of maneuvers that systematically degraded the opposing force's effectiveness. But the enemy pilots were skilled and determined, making the outcome far from certain. The air battle reached its climax when enemy reinforcements arrived from the Crimson Islands, bringing the total opposing force to nearly twice the size of the rescue squadron. Hayes found himself managing a complex engagement that required splitting his attention between offensive operations and protective coverage for Sarah's damaged aircraft. Sarah realized that her continued presence in the battle space was becoming a liability for the rescue force. Her damaged aircraft couldn't contribute to the air-to-air engagement, and protecting her was limiting the tactical options available to Hayes and his pilots. The decision she made in that moment would define her reputation for the remainder of her military career. Instead of accepting passive protection from the rescue force, Sarah chose to use her aircraft's remaining capabilities to support the overall tactical situation. Her damaged FA-18F couldn't engage enemy fighters directly, but it could provide electronic warfare support and target illumination that would enhance the effectiveness of the rescue force's weapon systems. Sarah began coordinating with Hayes' pilots, using her aircraft's sensors to provide tactical information that helped them prioritize threats and optimize their attacks. The contribution was modest from a technical standpoint, but its psychological impact on both friendly and enemy forces was significant. Sarah's willingness to continue fighting despite her aircraft's condition demonstrated a level of tactical courage that inspired the rescue pilots and apparently demoralized their opponents. The tide of the air battle began to turn as enemy aircraft withdrew toward their base, unwilling to accept the casualties that continued engagement would require. But the threat wasn't eliminated entirely, and the rescue force still faced the challenge of escorting Sarah's damaged aircraft through several hundred miles of potentially hostile airspace. Commander Hayes established a defensive formation around Sarah's F-28F, with his pilots positioned to provide maximum protection while conserving fuel for the long flight back to Falcon Ridge. The formation flying required precise coordination, particularly given the unpredictable handling characteristics of Sarah's damaged aircraft. The flight home became a test of endurance for all involved. Sarah's aircraft required constant attention to maintain basic flight operations, while the escort pilots had to adapt to her reduced speed and limited maneuverability. But the formation held together, maintained by the professional competence and mutual trust that define naval aviation at its best. The first sight of Falcon Ridge's runway lights was one of the most beautiful things Sarah had ever seen. But landing her damaged aircraft would require skills that went beyond anything she had demonstrated during the mission phase. The hydraulic problems had worsened during the flight, and her control authority was severely compromised. Chief Santos was waiting on the flight deck with her maintenance team, ready to assist with any emergency that might develop during the landing sequence. Her analysis of the aircraft's conditions suggested that Sarah would have only one opportunity to get the approach correct. The landing itself was a testament to Sarah's skill as a pilot and her understanding of aircraft behavior under extreme conditions. She brought the FA-18F down to the deck with a precision that seemed impossible given the mechanical problems, touching down so smoothly that observers barely detected the moment of contact. As Sarah shut down her engines and began the post-flight procedures, she was surrounded by personnel who understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The mission that everyone had declared impossible had been completed, and the pilot they had doubted had exceeded every expectation. But Sarah knew that the real significance of Operation Nightfall extended beyond the tactical success or her personal vindication. She had proven that unconventional thinking and precise execution could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, establishing precedents that would influence military aviation for generations to come. The debriefing sessions that followed would reveal the full scope of what had been accomplished, but Sarah understood that the mission's true impact would be measured not in immediate tactical gains, but in the expansion of what was considered possible in modern warfare. Admiral Torres was waiting in the ready room as Sarah completed her post-flight procedures, her expression mixing relief at Sarah's safe return with amazement at what had been accomplished. The conversation they were about to have would establish the foundation for Sarah's future career and the lessons that would be drawn from Operation Nightfall. But first, Torres wanted to acknowledge the personal courage that had made everything else possible. Lieutenant Chen, what you accomplished today will be studied and admired for decades to come. You've proven that determination and innovation can overcome any obstacle, no matter how impossible it might appear. Sarah's response reflected both her professional discipline and her understanding of the broader implications. Ma'am, the mission succeeded because we were willing to challenge conventional assumptions and trust in careful preparation. The techniques I used can be taught and improved upon. This was just the beginning. Those words would prove prophetic as the military began to analyze and incorporate the lessons learned from Sarah's unconventional approach to seemingly impossible tactical challenges. The debriefing room at Falcon Ridge had never hosted a session quite like this one. Admiral Torres sat at the head of a polished conference table, surrounded by intelligence officers, tactical analysts, and senior pilots, whose expressions ranged from incredulous to deeply thoughtful. Sarah occupied the chair typically reserved for visiting dignitaries, still wearing her flight suit despite the 6 hours that had passed since her landing. The preliminary mission reports scattered across the table told a story that challenged fundamental assumptions about modern warfare. Sarah's penetration of the Crimson Islands defensive network hadn't just succeeded. It had revealed capabilities and vulnerabilities that would reshape military planning for years to come. But the implications extended far beyond tactical considerations into questions about leadership, innovation, and the courage required to challenge established doctrine. Commander Patricia Wells, the base intelligence chief, had spent the morning analyzing data from Sarah's mission systems, correlating sensor readings with known enemy defensive positions to create the most detailed assessment of the rogue faction's capabilities ever assembled. The picture that emerged was both encouraging and deeply troubling. The encouraging news was that Sarah's unconventional approach had exploited genuine weaknesses in the enemy's defensive architecture. The thermal masking techniques she had developed could be replicated and improved upon. potentially revolutionizing how stealth operations were conducted in similar environments. Her success proved that careful analysis and creative thinking could overcome technological disadvantages. The troubling news was the sophistication of the enemy response once Sarah's presence had been detected. The coordination of the pursuit aircraft, the integration with ground-based systems, and the real-time adaptation to changing tactical conditions suggested capabilities that exceeded previous intelligence estimates by significant margins. Dr. Richard Hawkins, the Navy's leading expert on electronic warfare systems, had been analyzing the communication intercepts gathered during Sarah's escape and the subsequent rescue operation. His findings painted a picture of enemy capabilities that raised questions about the security of all current and planned military operations. The rogue faction wasn't just using advanced military equipment. They had developed command and control systems that in some respects exceeded what the Navy itself could deploy. Their ability to coordinate complex operations in real time, adapt to unexpected tactical developments, and maintain secure communications under intense jamming suggested access to cutting-edge technology and extensive professional training. Hawkins's analysis indicated that the enemy forces had been monitoring Navy communications during Operation Nightfall, possibly from the initial planning stages through the execution and rescue phases. The implications were staggering. If hostile forces could penetrate classified communication networks, then no military operation could be considered secure. Admiral Torres absorbed this intelligence with a composure that had characterized her 3-decade career, but privately she understood that the revelations demanded a complete reassessment of current security protocols. The success of Sarah's mission had potentially exposed vulnerabilities that could compromise future operations if not addressed immediately. Captain Marcus Webb, who had originally authorized Sarah's participation in Operation Nightfall, found himself grappling with the unintended consequences of what had seemed like a straightforward tactical decision. Sarah's success had validated his judgment about her capabilities, but it had also revealed systemic problems that extended far beyond any individual pilot's performance. The discussion that followed would influence military doctrine for generations, but it began with a simple question from Torres directed at Sarah herself. Lieutenant, based on what you observed during your mission, how would you assess the overall threat level posed by the forces controlling the Crimson Islands? Sarah's response reflected the analytical thinking that had made her unconventional approach successful. Ma'am, the defensive systems I encountered were more sophisticated than our intelligence assessments indicated, but they were also more rigid. The enemy has built a fortress mentality that prioritizes protection over operational flexibility. They're extremely dangerous within their established defensive perimeter, but potentially vulnerable to sustained operations that force them to adapt beyond their predetermined responses. The assessment was both tactically astute and strategically significant. Sarah had identified a potential approach for follow-up operations while highlighting the limitations that would constrain such efforts. Her first-hand experience provided insights that no amount of remote intelligence gathering could have achieved. Commander Hayes, who had led the rescue operation, contributed his own perspective based on the air-to-air engagement his pilots had fought. The enemy pilots were skilled and well-equipped, but they operated according to doctrine that emphasized coordination over individual initiative. When we disrupted their command and control communications, their effectiveness degraded significantly. The observation supported Sarah's assessment about the enemy's reliance on rigid defensive systems, but it also highlighted the sophistication of their training and equipment. These weren't irregulars flying obsolete aircraft. They were professional military forces with access to advanced technology and extensive operational support. Dr. Foster, who had been monitoring Sarah's physiological responses throughout the mission, provided insights into the human factors that had contributed to the operation's success. Lieutenant Chen maintained optimal performance levels under conditions that would have overwhelmed most pilots. Her psychological preparation was as important as her technical skills in achieving mission success. The comment raised questions about selection criteria for similar future operations. Sarah's success suggested that conventional assessments of pilot capability might be inadequate for missions that required extraordinary innovation and psychological resilience under extreme stress. Chief Santos, whose maintenance expertise had prepared Sarah's aircraft for the mission, offered a technical perspective that complemented the tactical and psychological assessments. The FA-18F performed beyond documented specifications during Lieutenant Chen's mission, but the stress on aircraft systems was severe. Future operations would require specialized maintenance support and potentially modified aircraft configurations. The observation highlighted the resource requirements that would be necessary to replicate Sarah's success on a larger scale. The techniques she had developed weren't just matters of pilot skill. They demanded aircraft performance that pushed technological capabilities to their absolute limits. Lieutenant Commander Park, who had detected the unauthorized communications during Sarah's escape, presented his analysis of enemy information warfare capabilities. The findings were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire debriefing, suggesting that the rogue faction possessed electronic warfare systems that could potentially compromise any military communication network. Park's assessment indicated that the enemy had been monitoring Operation Nightfall from the initial planning stages, using intelligence-gathering techniques that had apparently gone undetected until the mission's execution phase. The security implications were catastrophic if similar penetration was occurring across other military operations. Admiral Torres recognized that the intelligence revelations demanded immediate action at the highest levels of military command. The success of Sarah's mission had inadvertently exposed security vulnerabilities that could affect national defense strategy across multiple theaters of operation. The conversation shifted from tactical assessment to strategic planning, as Torres outlined the steps that would be necessary to address the security concerns, while capitalizing on the tactical innovations that Sarah had demonstrated. The approach would require coordination between multiple agencies and military services, representing one of the most comprehensive security reviews in recent military history. Sarah found herself at the center of discussions that extended far beyond her individual mission experience. Her tactical innovations were being analyzed as potential foundations for new operational doctrines, while her psychological approach to extreme stress was being studied as a model for future pilot selection and training programs. The transformation from doubted junior pilot to strategic innovator had occurred in less than 24 hours, but Sarah understood that the real challenges were just beginning. The techniques she had developed would need to be refined, tested, and integrated into broader military capabilities. More importantly, the security vulnerabilities her mission had revealed would need to be addressed before they could be exploited by hostile forces. Dr. Hawkins presented his recommendations for immediate security protocol changes, beginning with communication systems, but extending to operational planning and intelligence distribution. The measures would be disruptive and expensive, but the alternative was accepting that enemy forces could monitor and potentially counter any military operation. The discussion of security measures led to broader questions about operational innovation and the institutional changes that would be necessary to encourage creative approaches to tactical challenges. Sarah's success had demonstrated the value of unconventional thinking, but military organizations were traditionally structured to emphasize predictability and adherence to established procedures. Captain Webb addressed this institutional challenge directly. Lieutenant Chen's success wasn't just about her individual capabilities. It was about creating an environment where innovative approaches could be proposed, evaluated, and implemented despite institutional skepticism. We need to examine how our decision-making processes either encourage or discourage creative solutions to tactical problems. The observation touched on fundamental questions about military leadership and organizational culture. Sarah's mission had succeeded partly because Webb had been willing to authorize an unconventional approach despite significant doubts from other senior officers. But such leadership decisions couldn't depend on individual courage. They needed to be supported by institutional structures that rewarded innovation rather than punishing failure. Torres announced her intention to establish a specialized unit focused on developing and testing unconventional tactical approaches, with Sarah as the founding member and primary instructor. The unit would operate with unusual autonomy, reporting directly to senior command while maintaining the flexibility necessary for innovative operational development. The appointment represented both recognition of Sarah's capabilities and acknowledgement that her approach to tactical challenges represented a new paradigm that needed to be institutionalized. But Sarah understood that the assignment would be far more challenging than the original mission had been. Developing unconventional tactics in controlled environments was entirely different from implementing them under combat conditions. Sarah would need to train other pilots in techniques that had never been formally documented, while simultaneously working to address the security vulnerabilities that her success had revealed. The technical challenges would be significant, but the human factors would be even more complex. Sarah had succeeded partly because of unique psychological characteristics that enabled her to maintain performance under extreme stress. Identifying and developing similar capabilities in other pilots would require advances in selection criteria and training methodologies that didn't currently exist. Commander Rodriguez, whose intelligence analysis had supported the original mission planning, presented her assessment of the broader strategic implications. The success of Operation Nightfall had demonstrated that seemingly impregnable defensive positions could be penetrated through innovative tactics, but it had also revealed that enemy forces possessed capabilities that could threaten future operations. The strategic balance had shifted in ways that would influence military planning across multiple theaters. Enemy forces now understood that their defensive systems could be compromised through unconventional approaches, which would likely prompt adaptations designed to counter similar future operations. Meanwhile, friendly forces had gained new tactical capabilities, but had also discovered security vulnerabilities that needed immediate attention. Rodriguez's assessment highlighted the dynamic nature of military innovation and counter-innovation. Sarah's tactical breakthrough would eventually be countered by enemy adaptations, which would in turn require new innovations to maintain operational effectiveness. The cycle of innovation and adaptation would accelerate, demanding continuous development of new capabilities and approaches. The discussion turned to resource allocation and timeline development. For implementing the recommendations that had emerged from the debriefing, the security protocol changes would require immediate implementation, while the tactical innovation program would need several months to establish operational capability. Sarah's new assignment would begin immediately, but the full development of her specialized unit would require recruiting pilots with specific psychological and technical qualifications that might be difficult to identify through conventional selection processes. The challenge was compounded by the classified nature of the program, which would limit the pool of eligible candidates. Admiral Torres concluded the formal debriefing session but requested that Sarah remain for a private conversation that would address the personal implications of her new role. The discussion that followed would establish the foundation for Sarah's future career and her understanding of the responsibilities that accompanied her newfound status. Torres's private office overlooked the flight line where Sarah's damaged FA-18F was undergoing detailed technical analysis. The aircraft had been secured in a classified maintenance facility where specialists from multiple agencies were examining every component to understand how it had performed beyond documented specifications. The conversation began with Torres acknowledging the magnitude of what Sarah had accomplished, both in terms of immediate tactical success and broader strategic implications. "Lieutenant, what you achieved yesterday will influence military aviation for decades to come, but I want you to understand the full scope of what you're taking on with this new assignment." Sarah's response reflected her understanding of the challenges ahead. "Ma'am, I recognize that developing these techniques for broader implementation will be far more complex than executing them once under optimal conditions, but I believe the potential benefits justify the resource investment required." Torres appreciated Sarah's realistic assessment of the challenges, but she wanted to ensure that Sarah understood the personal cost that would accompany her new role. The specialized unit would operate under security restrictions that would limit Sarah's ability to discuss her work with family, friends, or even most military colleagues. The isolation that would be necessary to protect classified innovations would be profound, potentially affecting every aspect of Sarah's personal life. Torres had seen other exceptional officers struggle with the psychological demands of highly classified assignments, and she wanted Sarah to make an informed decision about accepting the role. Sarah's response revealed the depth of her commitment to military service and her understanding of the sacrifices that exceptional assignments required. "Admiral, the mission yesterday taught me that the most important work often requires personal sacrifices that can't be measured against conventional career metrics. I'm prepared to accept whatever restrictions are necessary to develop capabilities that could save lives and protect national security." The conversation continued for over an hour, covering practical aspects of the new assignment, security requirements, and the support systems that would be available to help Sarah manage the psychological demands of her new role. Torres wanted to ensure that Sarah had realistic expectations about what lay ahead. The discussion concluded with Torres formally offering Sarah promotion to lieutenant commander and assignment as director of the new Tactical Innovation Development Program. The promotion reflected both recognition of her demonstrated capabilities and the authority she would need to recruit and train other pilots in unconventional operational techniques. Sarah accepted the assignment and promotion with the understanding that her life was about to change in ways that would extend far beyond her military career. The techniques she had developed would need to be refined, documented, and taught to others who could carry forward the innovations she had pioneered. The establishment of the Tactical Innovation Development Program represented a fundamental shift in how the military approached operational challenges. Instead of relying exclusively on incremental improvements to existing doctrine, the program would actively seek revolutionary approaches that challenged conventional assumptions about what was possible. Sarah's first task would be developing selection criteria for pilots who possessed the psychological characteristics necessary for unconventional operations. The criteria would need to identify individuals capable of maintaining performance under extreme stress while demonstrating the creative thinking necessary for tactical innovation. The selection process would be unlike anything currently used in military aviation, incorporating psychological assessments, stress testing, and evaluations of creative problem-solving capabilities that had never been formally measured. Sarah would need to work with specialists from multiple disciplines to develop reliable methods for identifying exceptional candidates. The training program itself would present even greater challenges. Sarah would need to document techniques that had previously existed only in her intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior and atmospheric physics. The knowledge that had enabled her success would need to be systematized and communicated in ways that other pilots could learn and apply. The technical requirements for the training program would push the boundaries of what was possible with existing aircraft and simulation systems. Sarah's techniques required aircraft performance that exceeded normal operational parameters, which would necessitate specialized maintenance support and potentially modified aircraft configurations. The program's security requirements would add additional complexity to every aspect of development and implementation. The techniques Sarah had pioneered were classified at the highest levels, requiring security clearances and compartmentalization protocols that would limit how information could be shared even within the program itself. 6 months after Operation Nightfall, the Tactical Innovation Development Program had established operational capability with a carefully selected group of 12 pilots who had demonstrated the psychological and technical qualifications necessary for unconventional operations. The training facility at Falcon Ridge had been expanded with specialized equipment and simulation systems that enabled realistic preparation for missions that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible. Sarah's role had evolved from tactical innovator to program director and chief instructor, responsibilities that required skills she had never anticipated needing. Managing a classified program while simultaneously developing new operational capabilities demanded leadership abilities that went far beyond flying skills. The first graduation ceremony for the program was attended by senior officers from across the military, representing recognition that Sarah's innovations had become an institutional capability rather than an individual achievement. The pilots who completed the program would carry forward techniques that could be applied to tactical challenges that hadn't yet been identified. But Sarah understood that the real measure of the program's success would come when its graduates faced their first operational assignments. The techniques they had learned in controlled training environments would need to prove their effectiveness under actual combat conditions, with all the unpredictability and pressure that such situations entailed. The graduation ceremony concluded with Admiral Torres presenting Sarah with the Distinguished Flying Cross, recognition of her courage during Operation Nightfall, and her subsequent contributions to military aviation. But the award that meant the most to Sarah was the simple acknowledgement from her former colleagues that she had proven them wrong about what was possible. The skepticism that had greeted her initial proposal for Operation Nightfall had been replaced by institutional support for continued innovation and development of unconventional capabilities. The transformation represented not just personal vindication, but evidence that military organizations could adapt and evolve when presented with compelling demonstrations of new possibilities. As Sarah watched her first class of graduates receive their assignments to operational units around the world, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from doubted junior pilot to recognized expert in tactical innovation. The mission that everyone had declared impossible had become the foundation for capabilities that were already influencing military operations in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged. The techniques she had developed were being applied to challenges that extended far beyond the specific tactical situation she had faced over the Crimson Islands. Pilots trained in her methods were conducting operations that would have been considered impossible just months earlier, proving that innovation could be systematized and transmitted to others who shared the courage to challenge conventional limitations. But Sarah also understood that her greatest contribution might not be the specific techniques she had pioneered, but the demonstration that seemingly impossible challenges could be overcome through careful analysis, creative thinking, and the courage to attempt what others declared unachievable. The legacy of Operation Nightfall would ultimately be measured not in tactical victories or technological innovations, but in the expansion of what was considered possible when determination met preparation and conventional wisdom yielded to creative solutions. Sarah had proven that the impossible was often just another word for untested, and that conviction would continue to influence military aviation long after her own career had ended. The story of the pilot who couldn't handle combat had become the foundation for a new understanding of what could be accomplished when courage, skill, and innovation converged in the pursuit of mission success. And in proving her doubters wrong, Sarah had established precedents that would inspire future generations of pilots to challenge their own limitations and redefine the boundaries of human achievement. 3 years had passed since Operation Nightfall transformed Sarah Chen from a doubted junior pilot into one of the most influential figures in modern military aviation. The Tactical Innovation Development Program had evolved from an experimental unit into a cornerstone of naval aviation strategy, with graduates serving in operational roles across the Pacific Fleet and beyond. Sarah stood in the observation deck of the new Advanced Combat Training Center at Falcon Ridge, watching her latest class of candidates attempt the thermal masking exercise that had become the program's signature challenge. The facility itself represented a remarkable technological achievement, incorporating atmospheric simulation systems that could replicate the complex environmental conditions necessary for training in unconventional tactics. The pilot currently struggling through the exercise was Lieutenant Jennifer Walsh, a former test pilot whose technical background made her an ideal candidate for the program, despite her limited combat experience. Walsh's approach to the thermal masking challenge demonstrated the methodical thinking that characterized successful graduates, but she was still learning to trust the counterintuitive techniques that Sarah had pioneered. Dr. Amanda Foster, who had become the program's chief psychological evaluator, joined Sarah at the observation window with a tablet displaying real-time biometric data from the exercise participants. Foster's role had expanded significantly as the program grew, requiring her to develop entirely new assessment methodologies for identifying pilots capable of exceptional performance under extreme stress. The psychological profile required for success in unconventional operations had proven to be remarkably specific and surprisingly rare. Candidates needed exceptional technical skills combined with creative problem-solving abilities, but they also required psychological resilience that enabled peak performance despite operating outside established doctrinal frameworks. Foster's research had identified key personality characteristics that correlated with success in the program, but the selection process remained as much art as science. The intangible qualities that enabled pilots like Sarah to maintain clarity and precision under impossible circumstances couldn't be measured through conventional testing methodologies. Lieutenant Walsh completed the thermal masking exercise with precision that would have been considered exceptional just 3 years earlier, but Sarah recognized areas where her technique could be refined. The standards for the program had evolved continuously as understanding of the underlying principles improved and training methodologies became more sophisticated. Commander David Park, who had been promoted to serve as the program's operations director, approached with the morning intelligence briefing that had become a daily ritual. The information contained in these briefings was classified at levels that restricted access to fewer than 50 individuals worldwide, but it provided essential context for understanding how the program's innovations were being applied in operational environments. Park's latest briefing contained updates on 3 separate operations where program graduates had successfully completed missions that would have been impossible using conventional tactics. The success rate was remarkable, but Sarah understood that each success increased the likelihood that enemy forces would develop countermeasures designed to neutralize the advantages her techniques provided. The ongoing cycle of innovation and counter-innovation was accelerating, as program graduates demonstrated their capabilities in increasingly challenging operational environments. Enemy forces were adapting their defensive systems and tactical approaches to address the unconventional threats that Sarah's methods enabled, forcing continuous evolution of the techniques themselves. Chief Petty Officer Maria Santos, now serving as the program's senior maintenance advisor, had developed specialized procedures for preparing aircraft to operate beyond normal performance parameters. Her expertise had become essential as the program's techniques required aircraft modifications that pushed technological boundaries while maintaining operational reliability. Santos's maintenance protocols had evolved into a comprehensive system that enabled sustained operations at performance levels that would have been considered impossible during Sarah's original mission. The aircraft used in the program incorporated modifications that weren't available to conventional units, representing a significant resource investment that reflected the program's strategic importance. The technical challenges of maintaining aircraft operated at extreme performance levels had required innovations in materials, science, engine technology, and electronic systems that had applications extending far beyond the program itself. Santos often found herself consulting with aerospace manufacturers on developments that would eventually benefit all military aviation. Admiral Rebecca Torres, who had championed the program from its inception, visited Falcon Ridge monthly to review progress and address resource requirements with senior command. Her support had been essential during the program's early development, when institutional skepticism threatened to limit its growth and effectiveness. Torres's most recent visit had focused on expansion plans that would establish similar training facilities at naval installations worldwide. The demand for program graduates had exceeded the capacity of the Falcon Ridge facility, requiring a scaling approach that would maintain training quality while increasing output. The expansion plans represented both validation of the program's success and recognition of the evolving threat environment that made unconventional capabilities increasingly valuable. Military conflicts were becoming more complex and unpredictable, requiring tactical flexibility that conventional doctrine couldn't provide. Sarah's role had evolved from program director to strategic advisor, providing guidance on applications of unconventional tactics to challenges that extended beyond traditional aviation missions. Her insights were now being applied to problems ranging from intelligence gathering to humanitarian operations in contested environments. The transformation from operational pilot to strategic thinker had required Sarah to develop skills that weren't taught in any military training program. She had needed to learn how to translate tactical innovations into institutional capabilities, while maintaining the creative thinking that had made those innovations possible. Lieutenant Commander Jackson Hayes, who had led the rescue operation during Sarah's original mission, now served as one of the program's senior instructors. His experience in conventional air-to-air combat provided essential context for training pilots who needed to integrate unconventional techniques with traditional tactical skills. Hayes had initially been skeptical about the program's approach, but his experience training graduates had convinced him that the combination of conventional skills and unconventional techniques created capabilities that exceeded the sum of their individual components. His conversion from skeptic to advocate had helped establish credibility for the program within the broader aviation community. The instructor team now included specialists from multiple disciplines, reflecting the interdisciplinary nature of the challenges that program graduates would face in operational environments. The curriculum incorporated elements of atmospheric physics, psychology, advanced materials, science, and electronic warfare in addition to traditional aviation subjects. Dr. Richard Hawkins, whose analysis of enemy electronic warfare capabilities had revealed security vulnerabilities during Sarah's original mission, had become a regular consultant to the program. His ongoing research into adversary capabilities provided essential intelligence for developing countermeasures and operational security protocols. Hawkins's work had revealed that enemy forces were actively studying the program's techniques through intelligence gathering and analysis of operational outcomes. The recognition that adversaries were attempting to develop countermeasures had forced implementation of additional security measures that complicated training and operational planning. The security challenges associated with protecting innovative tactics from enemy intelligence gathering had become one of the program's most significant ongoing concerns. Techniques that provided tactical advantages could become liabilities if enemy forces developed effective countermeasures based on detailed understanding of their implementation. Sarah's original innovation of thermal masking had been refined and expanded into a comprehensive suite of environmental exploitation techniques that enabled operations in conditions previously considered impossible. But each new technique required careful evaluation of its vulnerability to detection and countermeasures. The program's research division, led by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, worked continuously to stay ahead of enemy adaptation efforts by developing new techniques and improving existing ones. Rodriguez's team included some of the military's most creative tactical thinkers, working on problems that required combining theoretical knowledge with practical operational experience. Rodriguez's latest research focused on exploiting electromagnetic phenomena to achieve stealth effects that were undetectable by conventional sensor systems. The theoretical foundation was solid, but practical application required flying techniques that pushed pilot capabilities to their absolute limits. The experimental nature of much of the program's work meant that failures were inevitable and potentially dangerous. Sarah had established safety protocols that allowed for innovative experimentation while protecting personnel from unnecessary risks, But the balance between safety and progress required constant attention. Lieutenant Walsh had progressed through the program's curriculum with exceptional performance, demonstrating mastery of techniques that had taken Sarah months to develop through trial and error. The systematization of unconventional tactics had accelerated the learning process while maintaining the high standards necessary for operational effectiveness. Walsh represented the new generation of pilots who would carry forward the innovations that Sarah had pioneered, but her background and approach were distinctly different from Sarah's original path to tactical innovation. The program had evolved to accommodate different learning styles and operational specializations while maintaining core competencies. The graduation ceremony for Walsh's class was attended by representatives from allied nations who were beginning to implement similar programs based on the Falcon Ridge model. The international interest reflected recognition that unconventional tactics were becoming essential capabilities for modern military forces. Sarah's influence had extended far beyond the U.S. Navy to shape tactical thinking in air forces around the world. The principles she had established were being adapted to different aircraft types, operational environments, and mission requirements, while maintaining the fundamental approach to challenging conventional limitations. The diplomatic implications of sharing unconventional tactical knowledge with allied nations required careful consideration of security concerns and strategic relationships. Sarah found herself consulting on decisions that affected international military cooperation at the highest levels of government. The success of the Tactical Innovation Development Program had attracted attention from civilian aviation as well, with commercial pilots beginning to study the environmental exploitation techniques for applications in challenging weather conditions and emergency situations. The crossover between military innovation and civilian safety represented an unexpected benefit of the program's development. Sarah's techniques for maintaining aircraft control under extreme conditions had proven valuable for civilian pilots facing severe weather emergencies or mechanical failures. Several commercial aviation incidents had been resolved successfully, using adaptations of techniques originally developed for military applications. The broader impact of the program extended beyond aviation to influence military thinking about innovation and institutional change. The success of unconventional approaches had encouraged other military specialties to examine their own doctrinal assumptions and explore creative solutions to operational challenges. Commander Patricia Wells, now serving as Deputy Director of Naval Intelligence, regularly briefed senior leadership on how the program's approach to tactical innovation was being applied to intelligence gathering and analysis. The willingness to challenge conventional assumptions had proven valuable across multiple military disciplines. The institutional changes necessary to support continuous innovation had required modifications to promotion criteria, training programs, and resource allocation procedures. The military had needed to develop new approaches to identifying and developing creative thinking capabilities among its personnel. Sarah's transition from operational pilot to institutional leader had provided insights into the organizational dynamics that either encouraged or discouraged innovation. Her experience had influenced policy changes that made it easier for other officers to propose and implement unconventional solutions to tactical challenges. The long-term sustainability of the program required developing next-generation leaders who could continue the innovation process as threats and technologies evolved. Sarah had made succession planning a priority, ensuring that the program's culture of creative thinking would survive changes in leadership and organizational structure. Lieutenant Commander Walsh had demonstrated potential for future leadership roles within the program, but developing her strategic thinking capabilities would require exposure to challenges that extended beyond tactical flying. Sarah had begun incorporating strategic planning exercises into the advanced curriculum to prepare graduates for broader responsibilities. The program's influence on naval aviation doctrine had been profound, with unconventional techniques being integrated into standard training programs and operational procedures. What had begun as experimental tactics had become accepted components of naval aviation capability. The transformation from experimental program to institutional capability represented validation of Sarah's original vision, but it also created new challenges related to maintaining the creative thinking that had made the program successful. The risk of institutionalization stifling innovation required constant attention to program culture and leadership development. Sarah's legacy would ultimately be measured not just by the tactical innovations she had pioneered, but by the institutional changes that enabled continuous development of new capabilities. The program had demonstrated that military organizations could adapt and evolve when provided with compelling examples of what was possible. As Sarah watched Lieutenant Walsh lead her class through final graduation exercises, she reflected on the journey that had transformed her from a doubted junior pilot to one of the most influential figures in modern military aviation. The mission that everyone had declared impossible had become the foundation for capabilities that were reshaping how military forces approached seemingly insurmountable challenges. The techniques she had developed over the Crimson Islands had evolved into a comprehensive system for operational innovation that was being applied to challenges she had never imagined. But more importantly, she had proven that institutional barriers to creative thinking could be overcome when determination met preparation and conventional wisdom yielded to demonstrated results. The story of the pilot who couldn't handle combat had become a testament to the power of challenging assumptions and the importance of supporting individuals who were willing to attempt what others declared impossible. And in establishing that precedent, Sarah had created opportunities for future generations of military personnel to redefine the boundaries of human achievement and institutional capability. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.